In an age before maps had drawn their borders, before books had preserved their names, the Arabian desert concealed within its sands stories too vast for any page to contain. The Arabs lived on the margins of great empires, caught between the hammer of Persia and the anvil of Rome, paying tribute at times, enslaved at others, and scorned at every turn. Persia in those days was an empire that knew no defeat. Its armies crushed kingdoms. Its kings sat on thrones of gold and regarded the Arab as nothing more than a desert wanderer tending his camels, a man not worth counting. But on one day, one of God's days, in a place called Dhi Qar on the soil of Iraq, a group of men from the tribe of Banu Bakr ibn Wa'il decided to say one word that the Persians had never grown accustomed to hearing from Arabs. They said, "No." And that single word became the opening of one of the most remarkable victories in human history. A victory won not by organized armies, not by advanced weapons, but by men who fought to defend their dignity and refused to be humiliated one more time. This is the documentary of Dhi Qar. Not merely a story of war, but a lesson in what happens when a downtrodden people decide to stand and fight. To understand the Battle of Dhi Qar, we must step back and see the world as it was at the dawn of the 7th century AD. The Arabian Peninsula lived to the rhythm of the tribe. No central state, no unified army, no authority to unite all people under one banner. Tribes waged war and formed alliances, sought revenge and made peace, and tribal loyalty was the constitution that governed them all. In the north of the peninsula, stretching toward Iraq, stood an Arab kingdom known as the Lakhmids, their capital Al-Hira. Arab in name, but in reality a long Persian arm operated from Ctesiphon, the capital of the Sasanian Empire. The Lakhmid kings sat on their thrones by Persian permission and paid their loyalty to Khosrow as a slave pays obedience to his master. Their primary mission? Keep the Arab tribes scattered, weak, and far from any notion of unity or revolt. The Sasanian Persian Empire, meanwhile, was at the height of its glory. Ruled by Khosrow II, a man of fierce pride who saw himself as the shadow of the gods upon the earth, tolerating no dissenting voice from anyone, least of all from an Arab of the desert. Into this context stepped al-Nu'man ibn al-Mundhir, the last king of Al-Hira, Arab in blood and spirit, but seated on a throne by Persian decree. Al-Nu'man was a shrewd man who knew his own worth, carrying in his heart an Arab pride that years of Persian service had never fully extinguished. One day, Khosrow II summoned him to the royal court at Ctesiphon. The emperor had heard that Al-Nu'man possessed precious war armors and prized horses, and he wanted them. But in truth, Khosrow wanted more. He wanted to remind al-Nu'man of his place and to prove that what al-Nu'man held was not truly his, but an imperial deposit. Al-Nu'man understood the message well. He knew that complying would mean total submission, the end of any last shred of dignity he still clung to. So he refused. It was a bold refusal in an age when no one refused Khosrow. Khosrow's fury was immense. He ordered al-Nu'man's arrest. Al-Nu'man was imprisoned at Ctesiphon, and accounts say he died in captivity. some say trampled by elephants. Whatever the details of his death, Khosrow's message to all Arabs was clear. This is what happens to those who defy the will of Persia. But before his capture, al-Nu'man had taken precautions. He sent his precious armors and weapons to a man of Banu Bakr ibn Wa'il, named Hani ibn Mas'ud al-Shaybani, entrusting them to his care, believing the Arab code of honor would ensure they were never surrendered against his wishes. He did not know that those armors would become the fuel for the greatest battle in pre-Islamic Arab history. After al-Nu'man's death, Khosrow II sent his envoys to Hani ibn Mas'ud, demanding the return of the armors. The Persian logic was simple. Al-Nu'man was a vassal king of Persia. What he owned belonged to Persia. With his death, those deposits reverted to the empire. But Hani saw the matter differently. He was an Arab man, and his first law was the law of tribe and honor. Whoever entrusts you with something, you do not surrender it except to its owner, or to one whom its owner has authorized. Al-Nu'man had died without authorizing the handover. The trust would remain where it was. Hani refused. This refusal was deeper in meaning than a mere dispute over armor. It was a declaration that there were still Arabs who saw themselves as masters of their own will, that Arab honor was not for sale, even at the price of imperial favor. When the news reached Khosrow, he could not conceive that such a response was possible. He ordered the assembly of an army to subdue Banu Bakr ibn Wa'il and recover the armors by force, a message to every Arab tribe that dared defy the will of Persia. The Persian army that mobilized was formidable by every measure. The plan, in Persian minds, was simple. The army advances, the Arabs see its scale, panic seizes them, they surrender the armors, and the story ends. No one in Ctesiphon imagined the battle would be real. Banu Bakr ibn Wa'il understood the scale of the danger. They were not reckless, but they stood before two choices and no third: submit with humiliation or fight with honor. The tribal elders deliberated. Some counseled surrender to avoid annihilation, but other voices said, "Those who yield today will be trampled tomorrow and the day after," and the loudest words belonged to those who refused. Then Hani ibn Mas'ud began distributing al-Nu'man's armors among the fighters. Those armors were no longer merely a deposit. They had become a symbol of defiance and a weapon of war at once. The man who refused to surrender them to Khosrow was now placing them on the shoulders of the men who would face Khosrow wearing them. The two sides moved toward each other, the Persians advancing with the confidence of the already victorious, the Arabs marching with the resolve of those who have nothing left to lose but their dignity. They met at a place known as Dhi Qar. When the two armies faced each other at Dhi Qar, the scene appeared strikingly unequal. On one side, the army of an ancient empire, organized, numerous, equipped, battle-hardened. On the other, the fighters of Banu Bakr and allied tribes bearing tribal weapons and hearts blazing with defiant fire. The Persians entered the field with no doubt about the outcome. Some officers may have regarded this as a disciplinary exercise, not a real war. This fatally wrong assessment of the enemy was their first mistake. In the Arab ranks, the atmosphere was entirely different. The men knew they were fighting a battle of existence. Defeat meant enslavement and complete humiliation of the tribe for generations. And so every fighter fought with everything he had, for on his shoulders he carried not just his own life, but the honor of his sons, his daughters, and all who would come after him. The battle opened in the customary fashion. Individual duels were fought, combats that carried enormous moral weight in that culture. And in those duels, the Arabs proved from the outset that they were not the feeble people the Persians had imagined. When the armies clashed in full engagement, an important tactical factor emerged. The terrain of Dhi Qar was not an open plain suited to wide maneuvers. The confined space reduced the Persians' ability to exploit their numerical superiority and organized formations. The fighting became face-to-face in narrow spaces, precisely the environment in which the tribal Arab fighter excelled, trained in skirmish and close individual combat. Persian cavalry could not open sufficient space to launch their organized charges. As the distance between the armies collapsed, Persian technical superiority became a burden, while individual courage and knowledge of the terrain became the critical tools of war. The battle stretched far longer than the Persians had expected. With every hour, moral pressure on the Persian side mounted, for they had come certain of a swift victory that never came. In one of the most intense phases, the Banu Bakr fighters penetrated a Persian flank and threw the entire formation into disorder. And when an organized army falls into confusion, it loses its greatest advantage, coordination. Some units began to pull back, and once retreat begins in one part, it spreads to the rest. The battle ended with the Persian army withdrawing from the field of Dhi Qar, leaving behind their dead, and something far more precious, leaving behind the legend that Persia could not be defeated. The Arabs stood on the field of battle, exhausted perhaps, but free. The day of Dhi Qar had been born. When the news of defeat reached Khosrow II in his court at Citizen, he did not believe it at first. The logic in which he had been raised said this outcome was impossible. Persia did not lose to desert nomads, and this was not bigotry, but historical fact that no one had contradicted until that day. But the news was confirmed, then confirmed again. It is said that Khosrow, in his fury, asked about the day on which the battle was fought and declared it a day of ill omen. He sought explanations in astrology and omens because a mind that believes in its own absolute superiority cannot find a rational explanation for its defeat. On the other side, the battle's impact on the Arab spirit was deep and far-reaching. The news spread as great stories spread, carried by merchants, poets, and travelers from tribe to tribe. And its message, every time it was told, carried one meaning: the Arabs had defeated Persia. This simple sentence did what 1,000 orators' speeches could not. It planted in Arab hearts something that had not been there before, or had been buried beneath an avalanche of defeats, humiliations, and tribute. It planted the feeling of capability. The poets played a major role in amplifying this impact. In that era, poetry served simultaneously as documentation, media, and mobilization. Much verse was composed about the day of Dhi Qar, glorifying heroism, immortalizing names, and redrawing the Arab's image of himself. Historians who came decades and centuries later looked at Dhi Qar and saw more than a military victory. They saw a signal of a coming shift in the region's balance of power. The Persian Empire, which had seemed unconquerable, appeared for the first time to be capable of being defeated, and that idea alone was a revolution in people's conception of what was possible. When Islam came a few years later and the armies of the Muslims set out toward Iraq and Persia, they did not set out into a psychological vacuum. They set out into a land where Dhi Qar had already planted the seed of confidence, a seed that had matured until the idea of confronting the great empire was no longer the impossibility it once seemed. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, acknowledged this meaning when he said, as historians relate, that Dhi Qar was the first day on which the Arabs gained justice over the Persians. This description elevates the battle beyond a military event to the level of a historic turning point. Perhaps the most eloquent testimony to Dhi Qar's depth is that we speak of it today, more than 14 centuries later, not because its casualties were the greatest, but because it carried a meaning that transcends time, that dignity is worth fighting for, and that the small can defeat the great when they are resolute. What does the day of Dhi Qar tell us after all these centuries? The first answer is that strength alone is not enough to decide conflicts. Persia was stronger by every material measure, and yet it lost. The reason was not in any deficiency of its weapons, but in something deeper, the difference in motivation between the two sides. Persian soldiers came to Dhi Qar because the emperor ordered it. They came to carry out a punitive mission that didn't feel personally theirs. The men of Banu Bakr, by contrast, fought knowing they were defending the final line, the one that, if crossed, would leave them without honor among the tribes forever. This difference in motivation creates an enormous difference on the field of battle. The man who fights because he has no other choice fights in an entirely different way from the man who simply has an assignment to complete. The second lesson concerns unity. Banu Bakr was not a large tribe standing alone, but when it declared its stance, voices and hands joined from other tribes who saw in that stance something worth standing beside. When dignity is declared openly, it draws toward it all those in whom some of it still remains. The third lesson is the lesson of miscalculation. When you underestimate your enemy and remove from your calculations his capacity for resistance, you do not weaken him, you weaken yourself. Persian arrogance was a weapon in the Arabs' hands that they never had to forge. They simply found it ready. Dhi Qar became over time more than a historical event. It became a reference point, a symbol, a parable. Whenever Arabs in later ages wished to say that hope was possible against an overwhelming force, they invoked Dhi Qar. Whenever they wished to glorify steadfastness and dignity, they returned to Dhi Qar. And this symbolic immortality is perhaps the battle's greatest victory of all, because a military victory ends its impact with the end of the war, but a victory that transforms into a symbol in the conscience of a people endures as long as that people endures.